From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Anne-Marie Hordern, I'm Joe Matthew.
A day of chaos in the House. Plans to elevate the temporary powers of Patrick McHenry stall after a closed-door meeting of GOP House members. Now we wait for third vote for Jim Jordan.
Jordan appearing to throw his support behind the plan before abandoning it in the face of fierce backlash by conservative lawmakers.
I'm still running for Speaker, and I plan to go to the floor and get the votes and win this race.
We'll speak with Democratic Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger of Virginia and Terry Haines of Pangaea Policy.
And an Oval Office address. President Biden will make a direct appeal to the country tonight at 8 p.m. regarding the war between Israel and Hamas. Joe, a rare Oval Office address that is for President Biden. Of course, this is on an expected announcement from the White House that they are going to be asking for $100 billion in aid.
That's right.
But that's going to be very difficult if he's not a Speaker of the House.
Well, that's also true. It's a real case to make for the president this evening. You make a great point. The venue is important to us here. It's not something that this president has used as much as others, and it really tells us a lot about the urgency behind this message. A lot of people don't realize, as we've been reporting at Bloomberg, Anne-Marie, that of that $100 billion, 60 could be going to Ukraine. So this isn't just an Israel story.
No, it's Ukraine, it's Taiwan, as well as the southern border. Basically cast a wide enough net. Hopefully you get all the votes in Congress. But we need to talk about Congress, Joe.
Well, that's right.
We are exactly where we were yesterday. This off-ramp the Republicans were talking about has seemed to collapse.
Well, that's true. It's kind of hard to tell where things stand right now. We were talking a lot earlier today about Patrick McHenry, and if you've been with us on Balance of Power, you know why. This idea of empowering him to be more than just a temporary speaker. Jim Jordan seemed to throw his weight behind that, Anne-Marie, then not. Now we're talking about a possible vote later on. As we heard from lawmakers today, the chaos reigns in Washington.
We made the pitch to members on the resolution as a way to lower the temperature and get back to work.
I think this is the wrong thing to do.
It poses great danger to the institution as the precedent that will be set.
I think it's constitutionally suspect.
Dead on arrival.
We decided that wasn't where we're going to go.
Our process at this point is to elect the Speaker of the House.
I'm still running for Speaker.
I think he's going to go back and talk to everybody and decide that. He's got to decide if he can get to the number.
Him going back to see if there's any movement. Can he get to 217? I think it's good.
The next logical step is getting the 22 in a room with Representative Jordan.
I want to go talk with a few of my colleagues. Particularly, I want to talk with the 20 individuals who voted against me so that we can move forward.
The next step is to go to the floor and have another vote.
There'll be possibly a vote for Speaker, possibly.
If he decides to go for a third, I expect a vote on the floor later tonight.
The Speaker designates can make a decision on the timeline, and so we'll see. Democracy's messy.
I plan to go to the floor and get the votes and win this race.
Joining us now around the table are Bloomberg's Washington Bureau Chief Peggy Collins and Nick Wadhams. Peggy, let's start with you. Jim Jordan ended there saying he plans to go to the floor again. All the while, we were expecting potentially an expansion of these powers of Patrick McHenry. What does the future look like for the House of Representatives?
Well, I think that's what a lot of America is asking right now. I think, it feels a little bit like Groundhog's Day, and at the end of each day we get to a phrase, something to the effect of, well, that didn't go well. So here we are again today on that front. I do think, though, it's important to remember that the stakes are getting higher and higher here. We are getting closer and closer to the November 17th date where we could have a shutdown again. And, of course, we have issues around the world and a Congress that's not able to fully govern.
We heard from the former Speaker, Kevin McCarthy, earlier today saying Patrick McHenry could take the reins until a new Speaker is elected. Here's how he put it.
If you watch him, he's not seeking to be Speaker. He believes in the continuity of government. He's chairman of a substantial committee. He understands the working. He's been here a number of years, so he understands how Congress works. He has respect on both sides of the aisle. He could carry out the job.
But it may not matter, of course, what Kevin McCarthy thinks at this point, Peggy. What part of the Republican conference is going to finally come together with the strength to make this decision?
Well, what we've seen is that they haven't had the ability to do it, but that the anger is growing, more vitriol and stronger each day. So I think the question is there going to be any type of breakthrough as soon as tonight where we could see the ball actually move forward? But again, I do think the fact that they're going days now without being able to fully govern is coming at a time where the stakes are really high, and we have President Biden who's going to go in front of the American people tonight and talk about whether or not we should spend more for some of the things that are happening around the world in places like the Ukraine and Israel.
Yeah, exactly. And Nick, that's where you really come in here. What can we expect from the president this evening? You know, to Joe's point yesterday, the venue is important. This is only his second Oval Office address of his presidency.
Right. I mean, I think you see how much this is a personal issue for Joe Biden. U.S. support for Israel. He was just in the country. I mean, that was essentially unprecedented. Tel Aviv is not a war zone, but there have been repeated warnings of missile attacks and things like that. So, I mean, that was a big show of support. He had a literal embrace with Prime Minister Netanyahu. So I think what you're going to see him do is spell out why he wants so much more money for Israel, why Israel is such a crucial ally, but then also crucially to be sending this warning that is a real concern in the Arab world, which is this cannot become a humanitarian disaster. We had the hospital strike. The Arab world is very much watching closely, and you know he's going to send that warning to Israel to make sure. Listen, if you do go ahead with a ground invasion, you've got to take civilians into account.
With that in mind, we spoke on Balance of Power with former Israeli ambassador to the U.S., Michael Oren, who spoke with us to say that America will have a key role in supporting Israel as the war continues. Think about this as the president prepares to speak tonight.
What we need are certain types of ammunition. We need certain capabilities, certainly in the intelligence field. And we need what I call the diplomatic Iron Dome, which is America's readiness to cast vetoes in the Security Council, as they did today, as the Russians, the Chinese will move to try to condemn us.
So bring us inside this supplemental budget request that we've been talking about here, Nick. What would these billions of dollars provide?
Well, I think what you're going to see is a streaming of munitions, chiefly. I mean, the U.S. wants to send Iron Dome interceptors because that is really the crisis point for Israel. You know, if this does become a wider war and you start to see missile strikes from a place like Lebanon by Hezbollah, there is the possibility that Israeli defenses could be overwhelmed. And we wouldn't be talking about hundreds. We could be talking about thousands and thousands. Wow. And so those supplies would drain. You could be looking at artillery shells. I mean, there is just so much that Israel will need. But really, I think it's important to see this money as, I mean, it's a large amount of money, but it's also a real symbol of Joe Biden's commitment and the fact that he's doing this. I mean, everybody is talking about the possibility of a ground invasion. It feels like it's going to come at any moment. So it's a crucial moment for the president.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, another crucial moment for the president as he looks to 2024, or at least our data shows, he has some work to do, Joe, in those swing states.
Well, that's for sure.
There's a Bloomberg News Morning Consult poll, and Trump is leading President Biden in a majority of these swing states, as well as on the economy. So, Peggy, I want to get your thoughts on there, as well as in foreign policy. So, Peggy, what's underlying some of this consternation voters are seeing in these key states when it comes to the economy?
Right. And I think it was, pretty startling that because as the president has made the economy one of his pillars of his reelection campaign, when you look at the states where the election could really come down to, it's clear that the voters are unhappy about the economy and feel like Trump could run the economy potentially better. Now, we have a long way to go between now and November 2024, but I think a lot of that has to do with prices. You know, we've talked about how prices have risen, the inflation has come down, but prices are still higher than where people felt they were 2 years ago. So I think that is a constant struggle. One of the other surprises from the poll, too, was that people were feeling in these swing states that Trump could do better on infrastructure than Biden, which is another key pillar of the Biden administration's, triumph, really, in terms of getting bipartisan infrastructure legislation through.
Well, remembering as well, that was a joke around here. It was a meme, Infrastructure Week for the balance of the Trump presidency. And he's blowing Joe Biden out of the water on this issue. Is that because these projects haven't actually started yet? People don't see shovels in the ground, or is there more to this?
I think that's part of it. You know, people want to turn around in their communities and be able to touch or see something where they can attribute to the government getting something done. So I think that is part of it. A lot of this money has yet to get out the door.
Yeah, fascinating. Great conversation with Bloomberg's Peggy Collins and Nick Wadhams. We've got a lot to look forward to tonight with the president. Of course, we'll be talking more about it. Coming up, we'll turn back to the drama, though, in the House of Representatives.
A big part of the problems in the House are about egos. We need to do our job, and the House has got to do its job better than it has. It's really why people don't like Washington, that these games are played to block Ukraine, to block Israel, to block these nominees.
We'll talk next with Terry Haines of Pangaea Policy about the effects of the chaos as they struggle to find a speaker. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg.
After 9/11, they created a system where you put names on a list if a case that you were no longer speaker for somebody to carry out that role until you elect a new speaker. When I put McHenry's name down, it was my belief that if something happened to me, that McHenry could run the floor until we elected a new speaker. It was not my intention when I put a name down that they couldn't do anything.
Former Speaker of the House Kevin McCarthy today on the role that Speaker Pro Tem may or may not play going forward, as we bring in now Terry Haines, the founder of Pangaea Policy, who, when those rules were written, helped to craft this whole idea as a senior House staffer at the time. Terry, I'm guessing you never thought we'd be having this conversation in this particular scenario now. And we can get into the rules here in a moment, but I've got to ask you first off, now that we anticipate a possible third round of voting for Jim Jordan tonight or not, what you're telling clients, because everything I'm reading from you is market negative.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it is market negative, Joe. You got a situation where, basically the markets think that the House, Congress, Washington can't handle its own business and keeps getting confirmation of that in the news every day. So, yeah, it is market negative. And the other thing I've been telling people is also market negative is that this goes on right now. We've got an 80% likelihood of a shutdown. The scenario where that shutdown percentage goes down is one in which, paradoxically, this no speaker situation goes on for a while. And what Republicans realize is, we absolutely have to extend existing funding for a period, a months long period of time. That'll provide a little bit of stability and would, relatively speaking, be a small markets positive. But it's not a good situation. And the last thing I'd say on it is that Republicans are ruining their reputation for being able to handle the economy, because everything that markets see today indicates they can't.
Let's talk about Jim Jordan for a moment, Terry. Do you think he's able to at least get closer to that 217 number if he was to go back on the floor for votes, as he says he will?
I think it's unlikely. It's certainly possible. I mean, the situation is awfully volatile, as we've all seen today. But one of the reasons why, Jordan came, short twice. He was a little shorter the second time than the first, but he endorsed the, McHenry strategy, I'll call it, McHenry till the end of the year strategy, after becoming aware of other House members actually trying to run the vote up against him a little bit more. So, I think he starts out. I think the presumption here is that he's not going to make it. And the politics are the same as they were before. I mean, this is, Jordan speakership is still not good for the centrists, New York, New Jersey, and the Northeast that arguably give Republicans the majority in the first place. They have no reason to back down or think the politics are different today. So, I'd say things are against him tonight.
Well, so if that's the case, he doesn't get three and he's not going to reach a fourth round, Terry. We're back to the drawing board and this idea that, well, there is no one in the Republican conference who can get 217, which brings us back to this idea of Patrick McHenry being empowered to do more. A lot of people think they're experts on this. You actually are, because you helped to write the rules. What do you think of this idea that Kevin McCarthy has floated? I believe it was Brendan Buck had an op-ed in the New York Times saying he actually already has the power. Just go ahead and bring a bill to the floor. These are unprecedented times. Could he do it?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me say one thing about McHenry and then address that. McHenry is one of the few people, I've named a couple others. I think Rules Chairman Cole, Congressman Graves might be two others. But McHenry is one of the few that's trusted by all sides and, actually has a track record of being able to bring these folks together as he did on the budget negotiations this spring. So, the House Republicans are not ready to sort of pull the McHenry lever. That's not to say they won't, though. And I still think there's likely to be a compromise speaker here. The thing I would say about the rules, and I hadn't read Brendan's piece, but I agree with it, is really this. What you have right now is you've got both political parties hiding behind a fiction. The fiction is that somehow, the things are far too complicated, and you can only run the House when there's a real speaker in place. That's actually not what the rule says. With the after 9/11, this is a continuity of government plan, as McCarthy just said on your intro, but. Continuity government plan, but continuity, throughout. It doesn't say continuity only in the sense of physical attack on the Capitol or anything like that. It's continuity of government plan. And the continuity is that there's a speaker pro tempore that, and I quote, may exercise such authorities of office of the speaker as may be necessary and appropriate. So, McHenry could actually run the House right now. He doesn't, he doesn't want to. His party wants a real speaker. House Republicans want a real speaker. Democrats are happy to let the mud wrestling continue. But right now, this situation advantages nobody. And what's forgotten in all of this is the duty that every member owes to the institution of the House. And keeping the House a viable place. And, they've, at least on the majority side, they've all completely forgotten that.
Why is it up for debate then? Why doesn't he just bring a bill to the floor? These are unprecedented times, domestically and internationally.
Well, when they have to, I think they will. One of the many things I wrote today, and unfortunately I wrote a lot, is that, you can talk about this, empowering the speaker argument all you want, but the moment a real crisis happens, Israel needs something instantly. Ukraine needs something instantly. We have a incursion on the southern border from terrorists. I mean, you can name your scenario that requires an immediate response. This whole empowering the speaker business will get dropped so fast it'll make your head spin.
Wow.
They'll do their jobs then.
Look, you're talking about very real possibilities here, Terry. It's just a matter of how urgent the cause is what you're saying. Then everyone gets religion on the rules that you helped to write.
Exactly. Exactly so, yes.
Terry, thank you so much for your insight. Couldn't have had a better voice on what's going on in the House today. Terry Haines, founder of Pangaea Policy. Coming up in the program, Federal Reserve Chair Jay Powell with Bloomberg's David Weston to talk inflation and the state of the U.S. economy. Highlights from that conversation coming up next, right here on Balance of Power.
We certainly have a very resilient economy on our hands. We've got the economy growing strongly. If you think back a year, many forecasts called for the U.S. economy to be in recession this year. Not only has that not happened, growth is now running for this year above its longer run trend. So that's been a surprise.
That was Fed Chair Jerome Powell speaking with Bloomberg's David Weston earlier today at the Economic Club of New York. Bloomberg's Kayleigh Lyons is here with more on the economic outlook. Kayleigh.
Yeah, Anne-Marie, he's talking there about growth being resilient, but you're seeing it showing up in other data as well. Just this morning, initial jobless claims at their lowest level since January came in significantly lower than expected, which shows the labor market is still hanging in there. So this all speaks to the idea that things are going pretty well despite the Fed having aggressively hiked rates. The question now is what the Fed takes that data and decides to do with monetary policy. The indication from Chairman Powell today was that they are not going to hike at the next meeting in the next couple of weeks. It's on November 1st. What he didn't rule out, though, is a further hike in the future. And it was really interesting. David actually asked him about what we've seen taking place in the bond market. The 10-year yield was up 7 basis points today. We are now right on the cusp of 5%, which is the highest going back to 2007. And what that means is that a lot of that tightening of the financial conditions the Fed is trying to achieve, some of that work is being done by the bond market. And Chairman Powell did say at the margin, it could mean that they need fewer further hikes. It could lessen the need for that. So today the market is now pricing in a lower chance of the Fed hiking again, now less than 50%. And they also think the Fed, though, might start cutting sooner, now seen in July rather than September. But of course, it's all going to depend on the economic data. And what is so interesting is even as the Fed chairman is talking about how the economy is resilient, you see time and again that voters aren't necessarily feeling that, including in the latest data, which you've mentioned, the Bloomberg Morning Consult poll. Yep. Biden is not getting good marks on the economy right now. And generally, people don't seem to be thrilled with Bidenomics.
Yeah, they certainly don't. Look at that. 49% bad, 26% good in terms of how people feel about Bidenomics. Also, Jay Powell today spoke about the concerns internationally, these geopolitical concerns. He wasn't the only one either.
No, you're hearing it from a lot of people. Of course, we've gotten bank earnings over the course of the last week and a half. Jamie Dimon said he thinks this is one of the most dangerous times the world has seen. And all of that does factor into the economic outlook. So this is actually something that Chairman Powell said in his speech today. Let's take a listen to that.
Geopolitical tensions are highly elevated and pose important risks to global economic activity. Of course, our institutional role at the Fed is to monitor these developments for their economic implications, which remain highly uncertain. But I will also say, speaking for myself personally, I found the attack on Israel horrifying, as is the prospect for more loss of innocent lives.
So as always, guys, there is a massive humanitarian consequence that we have to consider first and foremost. But the fact of the matter is, there is very much an economic one as well. We know that financial markets tend not to like uncertainty. There is a lot of uncertainty in certain parts of the world at the moment. And also, given the energy complex and how key the Middle East is for oil, that factors potentially into oil prices, which factors right back into energy overall and inflation. And that's something the Federal Reserve has to watch.
We know the Fed was already worried about the war in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. Does this just make them more data dependent than they were already?
Yeah, they always will be, Joe, but they are going to be looking to see if these kinds of conflicts start showing back up in the economic data in terms of price pressures, or whether or not it actually has a dampening effect overall on economic activity in certain parts of the world. Again, it comes down to this idea of uncertainty, and things very much are uncertain in the Middle East at the moment as we look at each and every development.
Great reporting, Kaylee. Thanks for bringing that to us, and a great conversation with David Weston. Coming up, Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger of Virginia will join us. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television. No end in sight to the chaos for House Republicans as GOP lawmakers struggle to elect a new speaker. Democratic Congresswoman from Virginia, Abigail Spanberger, joins us now from Capitol Hill. Congresswoman, thank you so much for your time. Let's just start with whether or not you have any indication if you're going to be called back this evening for a vote on the House floor for a new speaker.
The answer to your question is we don't know. We have been advised that we might be called back for a vote this evening. Certainly, Congressman Jordan lost additional votes when we went from the first vote series to the second vote series. And since that time, there's been additional Republican members of Congress who have come out publicly stating that on a third vote, they would abandon their prior support for him. But it seems that he is not yet willing to concede that he does not have 217 votes. And so the possibility remains that we might have a third failed speaker vote this evening.
Okay, so a third failed speaker vote, as you're now projecting on the air. If that's the case, and we have no reason to believe that that isn't true, and we have Republican members, Congresswoman, telling us on a regular basis that no one in their conference can get to 217. Are you prepared as a Democrat to have a conversation about empowering Patrick McHenry to start working as a real speaker?
The reality is we've been having conversations for weeks on the Democratic side of the aisle with our Republican colleagues, direct conversations. Hakeem Jeffries put out an op-ed. Some of our colleagues put out an open letter providing a whole variety of options for how we might be interested or able or focused on moving forward. The reality is the House has so much work to do, and we need to get those things done. A farm bill, security aid to Israel, security aid to Ukraine, funding our government, focusing on border security. The list goes on and on and on. And to be able to actually bring bills to the floor and pass them has to be our priority. So as it relates to what we are willing to do, I and so many of my colleagues are interested in pulling together a coalition to actually get work done. And if the way that we do that is by expanding the authorities of a temporary speaker, I think that is a wholly viable option that exists on the table.
So you'd be in favor of that individual being Patrick McHenry? You have no qualms with him?
Not specific to him, no. I think, certainly the full scope of what it would be, what it would look like for him to have expanded authorities, and the full text of the resolution we would ultimately be voting on, that would determine my ultimate decision. But in principle, I'm a Democrat. I'm in the minority party. It is my expectation that we would have a Republican speaker. And what I, as a Democrat, expect out of a Republican speaker is somebody who's focused on governing, somebody who's going to bring bills to the floor for them to pass in the House, go to the Senate, and go to the president's desk. And that means someone who is inclined to vote for and bring bipartisan bills forward. And so if that looks like expanding on a temporary basis the authorities of a temporary speaker McHenry, then those conversations are ones that I have been having and continue to be open to.
Congresswoman, I'd like to speak to the former CIA officer inside of you as we ask you a couple of questions about the situation in Israel. President Biden is about to speak to the nation tonight, as you well know, addressing from the Oval Office, creating a sense of urgency around this supplemental budget request for Israel. As we consider the prospect of an invasion of Gaza City at any moment right now, I wonder, with your background, the concerns that you have about what appears to have been a major intelligence failure leading up to that terror attack and what it might mean for the days ahead.
Well, you highlighted I'm a former CIA officer. I was a case officer, and I collected information on terrorist threats throughout the world. I'm also now a member of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. And so what I can tell you about how I've been looking at this, and certainly what we need to understand, is how is it that Hamas, a terrorist organization that we know has, control over Gaza, was able to get to the point where they could plan and then ultimately execute a terrorist attack of this size and scale within Israel. And that process of understanding how this could have happened will require, a full review of intelligence available, because were there perhaps links that could have been made or flags that should have been, red flags that should have gone up related to potential threats or worries that might have led people to realize that there was something so far along and so complex in scale and scope. Also, it helps into the future for us to look at, okay, so if it wasn't a lack of connecting the dots, what were the dots that were missing, right? It may not be a case of the information was there but not connected. Now we have a better understanding, and will, as they continue to do a review, of perhaps what information could have been collected that wasn't. But the reality certainly is that this is a horrific, large-scale terrorist attack that certainly any current U.S. intelligence community employee or officer, and certainly our counterparts in Israeli intelligence, are just continuing to reel at the reality that Hamas was able to organize and ultimately carry out such a horrific massacre of civilians in their homes and in their communities.
The Pentagon today said an American destroyer in the Red Sea intercepted cruise missiles and drones from Yemen fired towards Israel. These are Houthi rebels, another Iranian-backed proxy group. They're also seeing drones in Iraq and Syria towards our bases there. How concerned are you about the risk that this conflict is going to spread wider in the region?
I'm very concerned about a potential spread of conflict. Certainly, we know that between, Hamas, or the terrorist organization that carried out this particular large-scale terrorist attack, or efforts by the Iranians to fund and further push forth their proxies, be they the Houthis or Hezbollah, and they're, of course, funding and support to Hamas over many years. This is a time of great instability, which is why it's extraordinarily important that the Biden administration has sent military personnel to the region, both as an effort of deterrence, demonstrating U.S. commitment to Israel, our ally, and demonstrated a commitment to maintaining stability in the region.
Well, assuming you do get a speaker at some point here, Congresswoman, will you vote yes on this idea, this supplemental request that could add up to $100 billion for Israel, for Ukraine, for Taiwan, and for border security? Is that what your constituents want?
The short answer to your question is yes, I am going to vote for it. And as to what my constituents want, my constituents, and I am proud to represent an extraordinary number of veterans, an extraordinary number of active duty service members, and an extraordinary number of folks who have an eye towards democratic values, what American global leadership means in the world. And I hear from my constituents that they want to ensure that our tax dollars are being spent wisely, but also that they want to ensure that we are supporting our allies in their effort to deter and stop the terrorist threat, as is the case with Israel, and to support our allies who are fighting for their own democracy, to stop Vladimir Putin and his authoritarian regime, and ultimately to uphold American democratic values.
Well, we'd like to continue that conversation with you when it finally happens, assuming it does. Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger of Virginia, thanks for coming back to talk to us on Bloomberg. Coming up, we continue the conversation on the fight for the speakership with our political panel. It's up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. Republican Jim Jordan is seeking a third floor vote as we speak on his bid to become House Speaker. We just don't know if it's actually going to happen. For the latest, we assemble our political panel. Jim Kessler is back with us, Third Way Executive Vice President, along with Sarah Chamberlain, Republican Main Street Partnership President and CEO. It's great to have you both at the table in this time of uncertainty. And Sarah, I can't imagine what you're hearing right now. I want to remind everybody that the partnership has about 90 members in the Republican conference, and you're actually in the room for these conversations. If you don't know, we don't know. What's your gut tell you?
Okay, so I just got the latest update. Jim Jordan called the 20 members in who voted no. They were going to be there 15 minutes. They were there an hour and a half. Wow. It did not go as well as he had hoped. And 65% chance he does bring a vote tonight to the floor, but he does not have the votes yet. So there's more people dropping away. That 20, there's more people adding.
22 even.
It could be up to 30 even.
Wow, so he's going to continue to potentially shed votes. So why go this evening? Why not wait?
I have no idea what his plan is. I'm just telling you, the members are getting death threats. They're getting all kinds of...
Which he's come out and denounced.
He has, and they're sticking hard. So I think he definitely goes down again tonight, and then I don't know what the future holds.
So there could be a fourth, or we're done after 3 if that's the case.
It's really up to him.
Yeah.
See, we don't. If you're not in that position, you don't get to control that. The person who is running for speaker controls how many times he or she wants to be brought up.
You mentioned death threats, Anne-Marie. I feel like we haven't talked about this enough. Marionette Miller-Meeks,
who's a member of
Nick LaLota, who was on with us last evening,
also a member of
issuing statements on threats to their families. Don Bacon, not to mention a pressure campaign from Sean Hannity's producer. This stuff is working against Jim Jordan.
So it is. So really, what's going on is Jim Jordan maybe could have gotten there, but the outside pressure that came over the weekend and the threats have been a huge issue. It's kind of hardened, like, I'm not going to tolerate that. I'm not putting up with that. And when you're threatening people's spouses, their kids, that is not voting well. And I know that the congressman can't control that, but that is what's going on around there. And Don Bacon from Nebraska was one of the first ones, his wife. And I've heard them. I've read them.
I saw those
listened
text
to them.
messages.
It's all, they all are Republican Main Street Partnership members.
Good Lord.
You know, Joe, the animosity is really palpable. And we heard that today from former Speaker Kevin McCarthy describing what went on in the caucus meeting.
I was at the mic, I was speaking, and Matt Gaetz tried to interrupt, and so I told him to sit down, and he sat down.
What's your deal?
I think no, I told him to sit down. I think the entire conference screamed at him. People are, listen, the whole country, I think, would scream at Matt Gaetz right now.
Wow.
This feels unprecedented.
It is.
Are we seeing potentially a bigger divide than we can even expect within this Republican Party?
There's not as big a divide as you think. It's really aimed towards one person, maybe two people, but Matt Gaetz is the most disliked person within the Republican conference. Kevin McCarthy was kind when he said that. There were a couple members that wanted to punch him. So they kind of went at Gaetz and then they pulled back. But Matt Gaetz created this mess and didn't have a plan. I mean, there's no plan. He did what he did, and here we sit 2.5 weeks later, and there's no plan.
Well, there are others that joined him as well.
There are, but he's kind of the ringleader of that. I mean, he got all of this started, and he clearly didn't have any solution. And here we sit, and we can't do anything.
So Jim Kessler's at the table. You might not know that. You're very quiet over there.
I'm a potted plant.
I just want to welcome you back from a trip abroad. You look tan and rested. Is this helping you sleep at night, or are you actually worried about the future of the Republic?
Well, I've been worried about the future of the Republic since Donald Trump, went down the escalator. Look, I think this is an important moment for the country. And, look, I just want to say to Sarah and her group of members, this is your moment. And standing up to this and preventing Jim Jordan from becoming Speaker and Stephen Scalise after the Matt Gaetz stunt, this is part of saving the Republic. And those members have to stand strong. And, as in terms of the death threats, this happens to Democratic members all the time. Those same people that are calling in those death threats to Don Bacon and to the other members of Congress, I hear from Democratic House members, it's every single day. And it's time to, kill this hydra right now.
One of the ways to kill it, which people don't understand, they have to vote in primaries. I mean, if you're out there and you're voting in a primary, you can vote, especially in a gerrymandered district, if you vote for the Main Street type Republican or in a Democratic district, a third way type Republican, the country would be better served. You have to vote. If you match the Main Street philosophy, you got to vote in those primaries. We need you. The country needs you.
You're here.
All right, hold both your thoughts. Coming up, we have a Bloomberg poll we want to discuss with you. Trump leading Biden in key states as voters remain nervous about the U.S. economy. We'll be back with our political panel for the details next. This is Balance of Power, live from Washington. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television. President Biden is currently trailing behind Donald Trump in several swing states amid skepticism regarding his economic message. That's according to findings from Bloomberg's inaugural Bloomberg Morning Consult poll of 7 battleground states. For more, let's welcome back our political panel. Jim Kessler, Third Way Executive Vice President, and Sarah Chamberlain, Republican Main Street Partnership President and CEO. Okay, this poll is quite damaging, Jim, to President Biden. Most people don't understand Bidenomics. They don't think it's working. There's still concerns. Top priority is inflation, even when it comes to foreign policy. And President Biden's going to give a massive address this evening. They think Trump is better on China as well as Russia. How much more work does this administration, this campaign, need to be doing in these key battleground states?
Well, I think they've got a lot of work to do. And I would be, drowning in the toilet right now if this was October 2024
wow.
and this was the poll, but it's October 2023 and this is the poll. And
Sure.
it's like, if you've been through a number of these races, like, this is just not that unusual. And oftentimes, a successful president running for re-election, like, they're at their nadir at this point. So, look, that's not to say Biden should ignore these numbers. It's meaningless. It's not meaningless. It does mean that they have work to do. But I do believe that Biden has a story to tell. And if Donald Trump is the nominee, he also has a story to tell about Donald Trump. Campaigns matter. What you say matters. The next 13 months are going to matter. So, concerned, not panicked.
Let's forget the horse race, the top lines here for a second, though. When you look at the numbers on the economy and specifically infrastructure, I didn't say inflation, I said infrastructure, which is his signature achievement, right? The first since FDR, the biggest since FDR, the investment of a generation.
And one provision with bipartisan support.
Absolutely right. We're going to travel the country promoting that for the next year. And Donald Trump, who was famous for the joke about Infrastructure Week, is crushing him on this. When you look at independence, it's an even wider gap, Jim. What do you do about that?
So I think there is something underneath here that's worth exploring, which is, look, one of the issues that's, with Biden is the age issue, okay? And what I wonder when I see a poll number like that on infrastructure, because it's so obviously his achievement, is, are people saying, well, he couldn't have really done it because he's too old, and so somebody else must have been doing it. And so I do believe that Biden has to more effectively address the age issue, because it might be the thing that's holding down all those other poll numbers to show he actually is in command. He is making these decisions. He is making the calls. And we're going to see him tonight talking about Israel and Ukraine. That's right. He'll look like he's in command there.
We'll get to that in a moment. There's one thing that this poll does show, though. When there's these open-ended questions, people are concerned about Biden's age. But for Trump, many referenced his multiple indictments and legal entanglements. At the same day, we find out that his lawyer, Sidney Powell, is pleading guilty. How damaging could she be to Trump?
She potentially could be extremely damaging. She is absolutely in the room. Like, I'm in the room in the Main Street. Yeah. She was in the room with President Trump. So it'd be interesting to see. She must have something for them to give her a deal.
So when she said she was going to unleash the Kraken, she may have meant that about Donald Trump,
She
actually.
may very much. We'll see. It's going to be interesting to see what happens. But what we're finding in the Republican Main Street Partnership polling is, you're right, it's the age. They think President Biden is too old to have another term.
And tonight, that'll be a major test for him.
It will be.
Well, that's for sure.
As he gives this Oval Office address, the second only in his presidency. Jim, what are you expecting from the president this evening?
Well, foreign policy is his strength. It's been his strength for a very long time. And, what I expect to see here is, again, he's going to make a forceful statement on behalf of Israel, on behalf of Ukraine. But again, just getting to this issue of age, this is the place where you can show, age means wisdom, means experience. It means having relations that I can talk to all of these leaders and get something done. It means having patience, but also, having a steeled spine. So this could be part of him addressing America, because he rarely does that, and then saying, okay, he looks like somebody who's in command, because he was in command.
What do you make of the optics here, the use of the Oval Office? He's going to be jumping into people's living rooms. I realize we're not a three-network world anymore, but a lot of people will end up seeing this who may not even realize that it's coming. He's going to be making the case for funding for Israel on who knows what could be the eve of a ground invasion in Gaza. How risky is this, to the extent that he has thrown his support behind Benjamin Netanyahu and put his fingerprints on the strategy?
I think he has a lot of support within the Republican and the Democratic Party on this one, so I don't think it's a big risk for him. I think going in front of the American people, he has to do well. If he doesn't do well, that would be a crisis. But if he does well, there's a lot of people that really support him. I mean, the Main Street members are Intel chairman and other chairmen, and we need to support Ukraine and Israel this time.
It'll be interesting, Anne-Marie, to see how people dissect the language between Israel and Ukraine and how that resonates tomorrow, which I'm sure we'll be talking about a lot.
Right, and potentially he might also mention China, Taiwan, the southern border, because this $100 billion package is going to have all 4 of those pillars.
You said it. The president speaking at 8 p.m. Washington time. And our thanks, of course, to Jim Kessler, Third Way Executive Vice President, and Sarah Chamberlain, Republican Main Street Partnership President and CEO. We learn something every time we talk to them. Check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
Thanks for joining us so much on Balance of Power. Stick with Bloomberg. Of course, the president will be addressing the nation at 8 p.m., and we'll see you back here tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.